In the beginning there was order, a fragile web spun across the void, held by the will of men and the grace of unseen powers. But as with all things wrought by hands of flesh, decay set in. Corruption slithered into the hearts of those who ruled, and the colony of Carthage 9, nestled on the edge of the celestial frontier, fell into shadow, and the voices of the righteous were heard no more, drowned out by the cries of the broken and the laughter of the oppressor. It was said in those days that the light of justice flickered like a candle in the wind, and that the weight of sin bore down upon the colony like an unrelenting storm. The magistrate, once sworn to uphold law and balance, now feasted upon the spoils of the oppressed. His lords, silver-tongued and iron-fisted, ruled with a grip that choked the life from the colony's people. Yet there remained a remnant, a few whose hearts were not given over to corruption. But they too walked in the shadows, their paths divided, their souls weighed heavy by the burden of the age. Thus begins the tale of Jeremiah, Amos, and Elijah, the men who would not bow to the darkness, though their hearts and wills were tested in the fires of desolation. And behold, Jeremiah the lawman stood in the dust of the colony's streets, his eyes darkened by the years of struggle. Once, he had been a man of great conviction, called to serve and to protect, but the endless tide of sin and greed had worn him down. Now, he held together what little order remained, a thin line between chaos and despair. His badge, once gleaming, was now tarnished, like the ideals it once stood for. And Jeremiah's soul too was tarnished, for he had seen too much betrayal, too much injustice. His hand was quick to the iron on his hip, but slow to hope. Yet even so he did not yield, for it was written in the law of his fathers, "He who stands firm in the day of trial shall be as a fortress, though the storm rage against him." Then came Amos, a stranger from beyond the stars, his voice like a blade cutting through the fog of the colony's despair. He was a man of fire and thunder, clothed not in armor, but in the righteous anger of a prophet. Wherever Amos went, the people stirred, for his words carried the weight of truth long buried. He stood upon the rusted platforms of the colony's markets, crying out against the wickedness of the rulers. "Woe unto you, O Carthage, who devour the poor and trample the weak! Shall the heavens not see? Shall the stars not judge? For the blood of the innocent cries out, and the day of reckoning is at hand." And the people listened, for they were hungry not just for food but for justice. Amos spoke of a new age, of a reckoning that would sweep across the colony like a purging fire, and many began to whisper his name. But Amos was not without fear, for he knew well the danger of speaking truth in a land ruled by deceit. And as his voice rose against the corruption of the colony, so too did the eyes of the magistrate's enforcers turn toward him, and the shadow of death began to creep ever closer. Yet Amos was not alone in his defiance, for in the darkened alleys of Carthage 9, Elijah the rebel made his plans. Where Amos spoke of justice, Elijah spoke of action. His was not the way of words, but of fire and blood. He had once been a man of peace, but the cruelty of the world had burned that out of him, leaving only the iron will to see the oppressors fall. Elijah's heart was hardened by years of loss. He had seen too many of his kin fall to the lash and the rifle, and he had sworn by the stars themselves that he would not rest until the magistrate was cast down and the people freed from their chains. "The time for talk has ended," Elijah would say, his voice a growl beneath the clamor of the crowded bars and meeting rooms. "The day of judgment will not come with words, but with fire, and if the heavens will not bring it, then I shall." He moved in the shadows, gathering to him the outcasts and the broken men and women whose hope had been trampled into dust, but whose will was not yet broken. They were few, but they were fierce, and Elijah stoked their fury like a blacksmith at the forge. And so it was that in the midst of the desolation, these three came together: Jeremiah the weary lawman, Amos the fiery prophet, and Elijah the defiant rebel. And in the heavens, far beyond the gaze of men, the stars trembled, for the time of testing was near. Thus saith the vision of Ezekiel, son of Uriah, the seer of the stars. Behold, a sign shall be given in the firmament, a great fire shall descend from the heavens, and the colony shall be weighed in the balance. And who shall stand in the day of reckoning? Asterisk. In the days to come, the struggles of men would be but the prelude to a greater trial. Forces unseen moved in the depths of space, and the fate of Carthage 9 hung upon the choices of these three men. Would they find a path to salvation, or would their divided hearts lead to ruin? The stars themselves watched, waiting. And the land was dry, barren as the souls of those who ruled it, and the colony, Carthage 9, lay under the yoke of wicked men. Lo, the rulers of that place were gluttonous and fat, gorging themselves on the labor of the weak, and the people groaned beneath their hand, for the law was a shadow of what it once was, a mockery of justice. Jeremiah stood in the marketplace, his boots stirring the dust of 1,000 days without rain, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better years. Around him, the colony hummed with the low murmur of the oppressed, like the final breath of a dying man. The sun hung low, blood-red on the horizon, casting long shadows over the metal shacks and cracked earth. The badge on his chest was worn, its silver dulled by years of neglect, just as the law it represented had faded into disrepair. Jeremiah's eyes were tired, hardened by the weight of countless nights spent keeping the peace that never truly lasted. For what peace could there be in a place ruled by greed, where the law served only the rich and mighty? He'd been sheriff long enough to know that the law as it stood was a farce. A veneer of order plastered over a pit of corruption, yet still he stood there, his hand never far from the iron at his hip, the last remnant of a promise he'd once believed in. Now it came to pass in those days that Jeremiah walked the streets of the furnace, the heart of Carthage 9's toil, and he saw the works of men's hands, sweat and blood exchanged for scraps of bread. And in the eyes of the people there was no light, for they had forgotten hope, and the sound of joy was not heard in the land. In the square, Jeremiah watched the magistrates' enforcers rough up a miner. The man had dared to speak out, something about overdue wages or a sick child. It didn't matter. The enforcers, clad in their black armor, didn't listen. They never did. One of them shoved the miner into the dirt, planting a boot on his neck. The others laughed. Jeremiah's fingers itched to reach for his gun, but he didn't move. He knew how this would end. If he stepped in now, it would only bring more trouble. The enforcers would report back to the magistrate, and the people would pay the price in blood. He'd seen it too many times. "Go home," he muttered under his breath, though the words felt hollow, as if the wind carried them away before they ever reached the miner's ears. "This isn't your fight, old man." But even as he turned to leave, he heard the laughter of the enforcers. Their mockery echoed in his mind, a sharp reminder of the futility of his duty. He wasn't a lawman anymore. He was a relic, like the rusted starships that lay abandoned on the outskirts of the colony, hollow shells that once soared through the stars, now grounded in the dust. And behold, in the wilderness beyond the colony there walked a man, hardened by the sun and wind, a man whose heart burned with the fires of rebellion. His name was Elijah, and his wrath was like a tempest. Elijah crouched on a ridge overlooking the town, his eyes scanning the horizon. The furnace was quiet for now, but he knew it would not last. Beneath the surface, the colony was a smoldering coal, and it would only take a spark to set it ablaze. Elijah had been that spark in other places. He wasn't like Jeremiah. He didn't wait for justice. He made it. With his blaster holstered tight against his side and the scars of past battles etched into his skin, he was no stranger to violence. He had seen too much, done too much to believe in law. Law was a cage built to keep the powerful in control, and he'd spent his life breaking those cages. Below him, he spotted one of the magistrate's supply convoys rumbling through the wasteland, a train of hovercraft loaded with stolen wealth, food, and water. The convoy was flanked by armed guards, their rifles glinting in the sun. Elijah's eyes narrowed. These were the same supplies that the people of the furnace bled for, and the magistrate hoarded them like a dragon sitting on a pile of gold. "Not today," he whispered to himself. Elijah didn't wait for permission. He never did. He set his sights on the lead craft and pulled out his rifle. The crack of the shot echoed through the barren wasteland, and the lead driver slumped over. Chaos erupted below as the guards scrambled for cover. Elijah didn't give them time to organize. He was on them in a heartbeat, his blaster roaring like the thunder of judgment. And lo, in those days there came a man from the outer worlds, his words like fire, and his heart full of righteousness. His name was Amos, and he came to speak against the wickedness that had taken root in the land. Amos arrived at the colony on a day when the wind carried the scent of dust and despair. The people of Carthage 9 were bent beneath the weight of their oppression, their backs bowed like reeds in the wind. But Amos was not bent. He strode through the streets with the bearing of a man whose voice had been forged in the heat of the stars themselves. He mounted the steps of the old town square, once a place of justice, now a crumbling monument to what the colony had lost. From this platform he began to speak, his voice booming across the crowd that gathered like moths drawn to a flame. "Woe unto you, Carthage 9, for your sins are as great as the stars in the sky. You have allowed corruption to fester, and the rulers of this land grow fat while the people starve. But the day of reckoning draws near." The crowd stirred. The people had heard these words before, from men who had come and gone, leaving little change in their wake. But Amos's words carried a different weight. There was a fire in them, a righteous anger that kindled a spark of hope in the hearts of those who listened. Will you sit in the dust, content to be ground under the heel of those who oppress you? Or will you rise like the stars, bright and free, and cast off the chains of your masters? In the alleys, whispers spread. In the bars, glasses clinked with nervous hands. And in the hearts of the oppressed, the spark began to burn. And so it was that the three men, Jeremiah, Elijah, and Amos, walked different paths but were drawn together by the same storm. The days of peace in Carthage 9 were numbered, and the battle between justice and corruption was about to begin. The tension in the furnace thickened with every passing day. Amos's words, Elijah's strikes, and Jeremiah's weary attempts to hold the line were all strands in a web tightening around the colony. The oppressed were rising, their voices louder, their hands clutching at whatever weapons they could find. Yet in their fury they became unpredictable, dangerous. Jeremiah sat in his office, the walls closing in around him. Reports of violence spread like wildfire, with Elijah's name always close behind. His rogue actions were stirring chaos in a colony already on the edge. Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. He knew the law wasn't enough anymore, but what was the alternative? To let Elijah's violence take over, to follow Amos into a rebellion that might burn down the whole colony. The weight of the badge felt heavier than ever, and in the heavens the stars began to shift, as if unseen forces beyond mortal comprehension watched the unfolding drama below. The stage was set, the actors in place, and the time of decision drew near. And behold, the days grew darker, and the hearts of men burned with the fire of anger, for the weight of corruption had become too great to bear. Amos stood before the gathered crowd, his voice rising like a storm on the horizon. The square was full, more than ever before, and the faces that looked up at him were no longer merely desperate, they were determined. His words had taken root, and now the people of Carthage 9 had come to him, hungry for change. "Woe unto the rulers of this land, for your time has come," Amos declared, his arms raised high, eyes blazing with the fire of prophecy. "You have fattened yourselves on the backs of the poor, but now the poor will rise and their chains shall be broken." The crowd stirred, shouts rising from the back. Men and women, once beaten down by years of oppression, now clenched their fists, eyes filled with the promise of rebellion. The air crackled with tension, as if Amos's words were not merely heard, but felt deep in the bones of every listener. Among them, Jeremiah stood silently in the shadows, watching. He knew that this was the tipping point. Amos's sermons had been fanning the flames for weeks, but today, the fire had truly caught. If he didn't act soon, the entire colony would be engulfed in violence. But as he scanned the crowd, he saw not criminals or lawbreakers, he saw the oppressed, his people, and deep within him the question stirred again. What is the law if it does not serve justice? Now it came to pass that as Amos spoke, Elijah moved among the crowd, silent as the night, his eyes fixed not on the preacher, but on the enforcers of the magistrate who stood at the edges of the square. He saw their hands on their weapons, saw the nervous glances exchanged between them. Elijah knew the look of men preparing for a fight. He had seen it 100 times before. On distant worlds and in forgotten battles, the enforcers were ready to act, to stamp out the rebellion before it could take root. But Elijah was ready too. He moved like a shadow through the crowd, slipping past knots of people, his hand resting on the blaster at his hip. Unlike Jeremiah, he didn't hesitate. He had seen what came of hesitation, and he had long since made peace with what needed to be done. "The time for words is over," he whispered to himself as he reached the front of the crowd. His eyes locked on the captain of the enforcers, who had begun to push through the massive bodies, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Elijah's grip tightened on his weapon. "Let the day of reckoning begin." And lo, the hour had come, and the line between peace and chaos was thin as a breath, as the people gathered like dry kindling beneath the heat of the sun. The tension in the square was palpable, like the air before a storm. Amos, sensing the moment, lowered his voice, his final words resonating deeply in the hearts of his listeners. "Today we stand at the crossroads. One path leads to freedom, the other to continued slavery. What will you choose?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but before Amos could continue, a shot rang out. The sound cracked through the square like thunder, freezing everyone in place. The enforcers immediately raised their weapons, the crowd recoiling in fear, and there, at the front of the square, stood Elijah, his blaster still smoking. The captain of the enforcers lay dead at his feet. Chaos erupted. The enforcers surged forward, drawing their weapons and firing into the crowd. Screams filled the air as people scattered, some taking cover, others throwing rocks and debris at their attackers. The rebellion that Amos had stoked with words was now ignited by Elijah's violence. From the edge of the square, Jeremiah stepped forward, his heart pounding. His hand hovered near his gun, but he hesitated. He could feel the weight of his badge, the law that he had sworn to uphold, pulling him back. But what law was there now? What good was the law if it only protected the corrupt? As the screams and gunfire intensified, Jeremiah's resolve wavered. He watched as men and women, many of them unarmed, fell to the ground, caught in the crossfire between the enforcers and Elijah's strike. His heart clenched with each life lost, but amid the chaos a voice echoed in his mind, Amos's voice from his first sermon. "Woe unto those who uphold the law of the wicked. Justice is not found in the letters of corrupt men, but in the hearts of the righteous." Jeremiah's jaw tightened. He drew his gun. "And it came to pass that in the streets of Carthage 9 there was blood, and the peace of the land was broken, shattered by the hands of the corrupt and the righteous alike." Jeremiah moved through the chaos, his gun drawn, firing shots into the air to scatter the enforcers. He wasn't here to kill. He was here to stop the slaughter, but everywhere he looked, the rebellion was spilling out of control. Men and women, incited by Amos's words and Elijah's actions, had risen up against their oppressors, but now their fury was uncontained. They smashed windows, overturned vehicles, and charged at the enforcers with whatever weapons they could find. The line between justice and anarchy blurred as the once oppressed became violent, desperate to reclaim their dignity at any cost. Jeremiah grabbed a man who had taken a sledgehammer to the magistrate's supply warehouse, shaking him violently. "Stop this!" he shouted, but his voice was lost in the roar of rebellion. The man tore away from him, eyes wild with rage. Jeremiah cursed under his breath. This wasn't what he wanted. This wasn't justice, it was madness. Now Elijah, seeing the flames of rebellion rise, felt no fear, for his heart was hardened to the cries of men. He walked through the square, his blaster in hand, cutting down enforcers as he went. He had long since made peace with violence, and he saw no path but through blood. But as he strode through the carnage, he saw a face that made him pause. Jeremiah, standing at the center of it all, his gun drawn but his eyes full of conflict. Elijah approached him, his voice low. "It's done, lawman," Elijah said. "You knew this was coming. The law couldn't hold this place together anymore. Let it burn." Jeremiah turned to him, eyes filled with anger and something deeper, sorrow. "This isn't justice, Elijah. This is chaos. You've set fire to the whole colony." Elijah's gaze hardened. Sometimes things have to burn before they can be rebuilt. And behold, Jeremiah stood at the crossroads of his soul, torn between the law he had sworn to protect and the justice his heart longed for. In the square, Amos continued to shout to the people, trying to regain control of the movement he had started. He had never meant for it to come to this, for the violence to spiral out of control. But now, there was no turning back. The people surged around him, some inspired by his words, others consumed by their own thirst for vengeance. Amos's voice was lost in the clamor. He could see the fires spreading, the destruction spiraling beyond his control. This was not the righteous rebellion he had envisioned. This was chaos. "Brothers, sisters, stop!" Amos cried, his voice hoarse. "This is not our way. This is not justice." But his words fell on deaf ears. The uprising he had ignited now had a life of its own. Jeremiah stood between Amos and Elijah, his gun heavy in his hand, his badge even heavier on his chest. The colony was crumbling around him. The law he had once served reduced to nothing but ash and memory. But in his heart, a fire was burning, a fire that asked one question: what is justice? "Let it burn, Jeremiah," Elijah said again, his voice low and dangerous. "There's nothing left to save." Amos, seeing the lawmen struggle, stepped forward. "Jeremiah," he said, his voice softer now, "this isn't the end. We can still bring justice, but not like this. We need to rebuild together." Jeremiah's hand trembled on his gun. His whole life had been built around the law, but that law was dead. Now, he had to choose. Would he let the colony burn, as Elijah wanted, or would he try to save it, as Amos believed? The fate of Carthage 9 hinges on Jeremiah's choice, and so it was that the lawman, the rebel, and the preacher stood at the crossroads of fate as the colony tore itself apart around them. The time of decision had come. And it came to pass that the rebellion reached its tipping point, and Jeremiah the lawman stood at the gates of the magistrate's stronghold, his heart heavy with the burden of justice. For the time of peace had ended, and the sword of judgment had been drawn. Jeremiah's eyes traced the outline of the magistrate's compound, its high walls and imposing towers a stark reminder of the system that had failed so many. The fires of rebellion burned bright behind him. The people of Carthage 9 gathered in force, ready to tear down the last vestiges of the old order. His hand rested on his weapon, though the weight of it now felt different, heavier, final. He had made his choice. The law he once served was dead. What mattered now was what would rise from its ashes, and Jeremiah was determined that it would not be built on vengeance alone. "This is it, then," Amos said quietly, standing beside him. The preacher's eyes were fixed on the stronghold, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had seen too much. Jeremiah nodded, his gaze never leaving the gates. "We take this place and the old regime is finished, but we need to hold the line. If this turns into a slaughter, we'll lose everything." Amos gave him a long look. "I trust you, Jeremiah. The people trust you. Lead them well, and they'll follow. But this fight will cost us more than we know." Before Jeremiah could respond, the sound of blaster fire echoed from the far side of the square. The enforcers had made their move. The final battle had begun. Jeremiah drew his weapon, his heart pounding as he charged forward, leading the rebellion's forces toward the stronghold's gates. Chaos erupted around him. Gunfire, shouting, the clash of metal and bone, but through it all, Jeremiah's mind was clear. This was it, the final stand. The gates were breached, and as Jeremiah pushed into the heart of the stronghold, he caught sight of the magistrate's enforcers falling back, their defense crumbling. For a brief moment it seemed as though victory was within reach. But then, out of the smoke and dust, came a figure Jeremiah had not expected to see. Elijah, moving with the precision of a predator, cutting through the enforcers with ruthless efficiency. "Elijah!" Jeremiah shouted over the din. Elijah turned, his eyes hard and cold. "I told you, lawman, let it burn." Without another word, Elijah disappeared deeper into the stronghold, leaving Jeremiah to chase after him. And behold, the fires of battle raged within the magistrate's stronghold, and Elijah, the lone rebel, walked among the chaos like a man possessed. His heart was cold as iron, for he had long since made his peace with the path of destruction. Jeremiah found Elijah in the central chamber, where the last of the magistrate's enforcers were making their final stand. Blood stained the walls, and the air was thick with the acrid stench of smoke and death. Elijah moved like a shadow through the carnage, his blaster flashing in the dim light as he cut down anyone who stood in his way. "Elijah!" Jeremiah called, his voice hoarse from the battle. "Stop this!" Elijah turned to face him, his expression hard and unyielding. "There's no stopping now, lawman. This is what you signed up for. You knew what it would take to bring this place down." Jeremiah shook his head, stepping forward with his weapon lowered. "We're not here to destroy everything. We're here to build something better. Killing them all won't fix anything." For a moment, Elijah's eyes softened, just enough for Jeremiah to see the man behind the warrior, the man who had once believed in something more than violence. But then, as quickly as it came, that flicker of humanity vanished, replaced by the cold fire of a man who had seen too much, lost too much. "You don't understand, Jeremiah," Elijah said, his voice low and dangerous. "There's no building a future here. This place was broken long before we got here. The only way forward is through fire." Jeremiah's heart sank. He had hoped that Elijah would see reason, that the man who had once stood for justice could be redeemed. But now he realized that Elijah was too far gone. The rebellion had consumed him. "You can't win this way, Elijah," Jeremiah said, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "If you go down this path, you'll destroy yourself and everything we've fought for." Elijah's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Maybe that's the price we have to pay." Without another word, Elijah turned and disappeared into the smoke, leaving Jeremiah behind. The sound of battle raged on, but for Jeremiah the fight was already over. And so it was that Elijah, the lone rebel, vanished into the shadows of war, his path diverging from that of the people. For though he had fought for justice, the fire in his heart had consumed him, and he walked a road of destruction. Jeremiah stood alone in the aftermath, the stronghold falling into the hands of the rebellion. The magistrate was defeated, and the people of Carthage 9 had won their first victory. But it was a hollow victory for Jeremiah. He had lost a brother in arms to the same darkness they had fought against. As the smoke cleared, Jeremiah knew that his part in this story was coming to an end. He had done what he could, but the weight of leadership had taken its toll. The colony was in the hands of the people now, Amos, Hosea, and those who believed in rebuilding. But his own road was finished. He turned away from the stronghold, leaving the fires of rebellion behind him. And thus Jeremiah, the weary lawman, departed from the field of battle, his heart heavy with the knowledge that though he had fought for justice, the road ahead was not his to walk. He left the colony to those who remained, for his time had come to an end. And in the days that followed the rising of the people, there came a man from the desolate places. His name was Ezekiel, and his eyes were opened to the stars. Yet the people would not listen to him, for his words were strange and his visions dark. But he cried out, for the end was near. Ezekiel had lived on the edge of the colony for as long as anyone could remember, a solitary figure, known to most only by the mutterings that escaped his lips and the wide, haunted look in his eyes. They called him mad, cursed by the stars. But Ezekiel knew better. The stars spoke to him. In their flickering light, he had seen things, terrible, glorious things, things that no man should see. He wandered the streets now, his feet dragging through the dust, his eyes cast upward, always toward the heavens. The people ignored him as they always had, their eyes focused on the earthly struggles that consumed them. They did not see the signs, but Ezekiel saw them. And his heart trembled, for the stars were shifting, and a great darkness was coming. He stopped in the center of the marketplace, where the rubble from the recent uprising still lay scattered across the ground. His voice rose like a trumpet, cutting through the clamor of the busy streets. "Woe unto you, Carthage, for your time is at an end. Look to the heavens, for they are moving. A great storm approaches, a fire from beyond the stars." People paused, some glancing up at the sky, others shaking their heads in disdain. To them, Ezekiel was just another madman in a colony full of broken souls. But his words carried weight, even if they did not yet understand them. And lo, among the people stood Hosea, his heart burdened by many things. For he was a man betrayed, yet he still sought redemption for the colony that had wronged him. Hosea had been watching Ezekiel for days now. The madman's words tugged at something deep within him. Hosea had never believed in visions, not until his own life had crumbled beneath the weight of betrayal. But Ezekiel's warnings struck a chord. There was something more to this man's ramblings, something that Hosea couldn't shake. He approached Ezekiel slowly, drawing little attention as the prophet continued to cry out. "Ezekiel," Hosea said, his voice low, steady, "what do you see?" Ezekiel turned his wide eyes on Hosea, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The end, Hosea, the end of all things. The stars are speaking, and what they say is destruction, fire, judgment. We must prepare or all will be lost." Hosea's chest tightened. He had seen his own destruction once, when those he trusted most turned against him. But the colony was still standing, even after the rebellion, even after the bloodshed. Could Ezekiel be right? Was there something greater coming? Something they could not fight? "Tell me more," Hosea whispered, his heart torn between fear and hope. "What must we do?" And it came to pass that Ezekiel led Hosea to the edge of the colony, to a place where the stars were bright and the sky was vast. There, in the silence of the wilderness, Ezekiel spoke of the things he had seen. The two men stood on a rocky ridge, overlooking the barren expanse that stretched out beyond the colony's borders. Above them, the sky was clear, and the stars shone with a cold, distant light. Ezekiel knelt, his hands tracing patterns in the dirt, his eyes wide and unblinking as he spoke. "In the night, the heavens opened, and I saw a great fire in the sky. It moved like a beast, devouring the stars as it came. And I heard a voice like thunder, telling me that this fire would fall upon us, and none would be spared." Hosea listened, his heart heavy with doubt, but also a strange sense of awe. There was a power in Ezekiel's words, a weight that made it hard to dismiss him as simply mad. And yet, how could he believe in such things? How could a fire from the heavens be the answer to the colony's problems? "You're saying we're doomed," Hosea said, his voice quiet. "That nothing we do here matters because something beyond us is coming to destroy it all." Ezekiel turned to him, his eyes filled with an intensity that sent chills down Hosea's spine. "I'm saying we must prepare. The corruption of this colony has called down judgment from the stars, but there may yet be a way to survive if we listen to the signs, if we act before it is too late." And Amos, the preacher of the frontier, still walked among the people, stirring them to action, for he believed that justice could be won through their hands. But the warnings of Ezekiel weighed heavy upon his heart. Amos stood before a crowd, his voice steady but troubled. Since the uprising, the colony had been in a fragile state, teetering between chaos and something new. The old rulers were still in power, though weakened by the rebellion. And now Amos was torn. Should he push the people harder? Should he lead them into outright revolution? Or was there another way? He had heard Ezekiel's ravings, had seen the strange, haunted look in Hosea's eyes after he'd spoken with the visionary. And though Amos was not one to put stock in omens and prophecies, there was something about the tension in the air, something he couldn't shake. "The time for justice is now," Amos declared, his voice ringing out across the crowd. "But we must be wise in how we act. There are those who would lead us into chaos, and there are dangers beyond our understanding. We must be vigilant, for the fight is not just against the rulers of this colony, but against the forces that would tear it apart." The people murmured, some nodding in agreement, others growing restless. They wanted action, they wanted change, now. But Amos knew that rushing headlong into battle could destroy everything they had worked for. He couldn't let this colony fall into the same mistakes of the past. After the crowd dispersed, Amos found himself standing alone, staring up at the sky. The stars were bright, and for the first time Amos wondered if perhaps Ezekiel was right. Perhaps there was something greater at work here, something they could not control. And lo, Hosea wandered in the wilderness of his own soul, torn between the prophet's warnings and the preacher's call to action. For he had seen betrayal before, and it had left scars that time could not heal. Hosea returned to the colony, his heart heavy with the weight of Ezekiel's visions. He could not ignore the strange sense of foreboding that now hung over him, like a shadow that grew with every passing day. But at the same time, he could not forget Amos's call for justice. The people needed a leader. They needed hope. And yet, what hope was there if the stars themselves had turned against them? He made his way through the narrow streets, his mind racing. He had trusted before, and that trust had been betrayed. The scars of that betrayal still haunted him, and now he found himself in the same position. Who could he trust? Amos, the preacher whose words stirred the hearts of the people but might lead them to ruin? Or Ezekiel, the madman whose visions might hold the key to survival, but who offered no clear path forward? Hosea stopped in front of a crumbling building, the place where he had once stood side by side with men he thought were his brothers, men who had turned on him the moment the battle was lost. They had left him for dead, but he had survived. And now, here he was again, on the edge of something he couldn't fully understand. "What am I supposed to do?" he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. But there was no answer, only the cold wind and the distant hum of the colony. And so it was that the three men, Amos, Hosea, and Ezekiel, stood at the threshold of the unknown. The stars were shifting, and the future of Carthage 9 hung in the balance. And behold, a sign appeared in the heavens, and the people trembled, for the stars had begun to move, and the skies were filled with strange lights. The night sky above Carthage 9 was alight with strange colors, swirling patterns of light that stretched across the stars. It was like nothing the people had ever seen before, a celestial display that sent whispers of fear through the streets. Some called it a miracle, others a curse. But all could feel the tension in the air, the sense that something was coming. Ezekiel stood on the ridge outside the colony, his arms raised to the heavens, his voice crying out, "It is here, the fire from beyond the stars. The judgment of the heavens is upon us." In the colony below, Amos watched the sky with wide eyes. His heart pounded in his chest as the cosmic display unfolded, its beauty and terror mingling in his mind. This was no ordinary event. This was something else. Something divine? Hosea, standing beside him, clenched his fists, his mind spinning. Could this be the sign Ezekiel had warned him about? Was this the beginning of the end, or was there still time to act? The people gathered in the streets, looking up at the sky in awe and fear. And as the lights danced above them, Amos knew that the battle for Carthage 9 had only just begun. And thus, the conflict within the colony deepened, as the heavens themselves bore witness to the fate of men. Ezekiel's visions had become reality, and now the people of Carthage 9 would face their greatest trial yet. And it came to pass that the signs in the heavens grew stronger, and Ezekiel the visionary walked among the people crying out, for the day of judgment was near. But many still did not believe, and the hearts of men were hardened to his words. Ezekiel's hands trembled as he looked up at the sky, where the swirling lights from the stars flickered in strange and haunting patterns. The visions had been coming faster, more intensely, and now, even as he walked through the colony, the images burned in his mind. Fires from beyond the stars, shadows consuming worlds, a vast power approaching, inexorable and devastating. He could see it, even if no one else could. "The heavens speak, and none listen," Ezekiel shouted as he stumbled through the market, his voice ragged from days without rest. "The stars tremble, the fire is coming. Will you not hear? Will you not see?" People turned their heads, some in fear, others in annoyance. Ezekiel had always been the madman, the outcast, and even now, with strange lights in the sky, few took his warning seriously. To most, he was just another broken man in a broken colony, but not everyone dismissed him. Hosea watched from a distance, his heart heavy with doubt and conviction warring within him. He had spoken with Ezekiel, listened to his warnings, and though the visions were strange and terrifying, Hosea felt there was truth in them. The cosmic forces Ezekiel spoke of felt real, tangible, like a shadow hanging over the colony. "Ezekiel," Hosea called, stepping forward. The visionary turned, his wide eyes locking onto Hosea with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. "What do we do?" "You cannot stop it," Ezekiel said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "The fire will come and the stars will fall, but there may be a way to survive, a way to be spared." Hosea stepped closer, his breath shallow. "How? What must we do?" Ezekiel's eyes darted to the sky, then back to Hosea. "The signs. The signs will tell us when, but when the heavens open, we must be ready. We must seek the hidden places, the places where the stars cannot reach." Hosea's brow furrowed. The hidden places, what did that mean? Before he could ask, Ezekiel had already moved on, his voice rising again, shouting warnings to the crowd. And as Hosea watched him go, a deep sense of foreboding settled into his bones. The rebellion had stirred hope, but Ezekiel's words made it clear. There were greater forces at play, forces that could not be defeated by weapons or revolution. And behold, the rebellion continued to spread, and Amos, the preacher, grew weary, for though the people followed him, their hearts were divided. Some sought justice, but others sought only blood. Amos stood before a crowd of rebels, his hands gripping the edges of the podium as he spoke. The rebellion had taken root across Carthage 9, but the people were restless. The victory over the magistrate had come at a cost. Too much blood spilled, too many innocents caught in the crossfire. Now, with the old order crumbling, the people looked to Amos for guidance, but the preacher was torn. "We fight for a new world," Amos said, his voice steady, though his heart wavered. "But we must not become the very thing we sought to overthrow. Justice is what we seek, not revenge." A murmur ran through the crowd. There were those who had followed Amos from the beginning, believing in his vision of a just and fair society. But there were others, those hardened by years of oppression, who saw the rebellion as an opportunity to take power for themselves. Their eyes were hungry for more than justice. They were hungry for control. "Justice!" a voice called from the back of the crowd. Amos recognized the man, a former enforcer who had joined the rebellion in its early days, but whose heart still burned with the violence of the old ways. "Justice won't fill our bellies or protect us from the forces out there. We need power. We need to take what's ours." The crowd shifted uneasily, and Amos felt the divide growing wider. He could feel the tension in the air. Some of the people agreed with the enforcer, others looked to Amos for leadership. But there was a growing sense of fracture, a sense that the unity they had fought for was slipping away. Amos raised his hand, silencing the crowd. "I understand your pain. I understand your anger. But if we lose sight of what we're fighting for, we become no better than the men who oppressed us." His words were met with a mix of agreement and muttering dissent. The rebellion had unleashed forces that were difficult to control, and Amos knew that his hold on the movement was slipping. And it came to pass that Hosea, the survivor, walked among the people, his heart torn, for though he sought redemption for the colony, he feared that betrayal had already taken root among them. Hosea moved through the crowded streets, his mind racing with Ezekiel's warnings and the growing unrest within the rebellion. He had always been wary of trusting others. His past betrayals had left scars that time could not heal. And now he could feel that same betrayal lurking in the shadows, within the very rebellion they had fought to build. Rumors had reached him of secret deals being made between former enforcers and those who sought to seize control of the rebellion. Hosea had tried to dismiss them at first, but now, as the divide among the people grew, the whispers of treachery became too loud to ignore. He found himself in a dimly lit bar at the edge of the furnace, where men and women spoke in hushed tones, their eyes shifting nervously. Hosea's gaze landed on a familiar face. One of the rebel leaders, a man named Kaldor, who had once fought alongside Amos but had recently been stirring dissent. "Kaldor," Hosea called, stepping forward. Kaldor turned, his eyes narrowing. "Hosea, what brings you here?" Hosea sat across from him, his voice low. "I've heard things about you, about the people you're talking to." Kaldor's lips curled into a smile, but it was a cold, calculating expression. "You always were the cautious type, but you've been out of the game too long, Hosea. This rebellion isn't just about ideals, it's about survival. The old rules don't apply anymore." "We're not here to build another empire," Hosea said, his voice firm. "We're here to build something better." Kaldor leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Better? Better is whatever keeps us alive. The people want more than speeches. They want security, power, and if you think they're going to follow Amos's sermons forever, you're a fool." Hosea's fists clenched. The betrayal he had feared was here, right in front of him. Kaldor and those like him weren't interested in justice. They were using the rebellion as a stepping stone to power. And Hosea knew that if they succeeded, the colony would fall into the same cycle of corruption that had doomed it before. But before Hosea could respond, the ground beneath them shook violently. Glasses rattled on the bar and the lights flickered. A deep, rumbling sound filled the air, like thunder from beneath the earth. Kaldor's eyes widened. "What the hell is that?" And behold, a great sign appeared in the heavens, and the people of Carthage 9 trembled, for the skies were filled with fire and the stars began to fall. The ground shook as Amos stumbled out of the meeting hall, his eyes fixed on the sky. Around him, the people of the colony had come to a standstill, their eyes wide with fear and wonder. Above them, the swirling lights that had danced in the sky for weeks now intensified, becoming a vortex of fiery reds and oranges. The air hummed with an unnatural energy, and a low, otherworldly sound echoed across the landscape. Hosea emerged from the bar, his heart pounding. The vision Ezekiel had warned about was coming to pass. The heavens were opening. Ezekiel appeared in the crowd, his face pale but resolute, his arms raised to the sky. "The fire has come. The stars have spoken. Judgment is upon us," he cried, his voice trembling with both awe and terror. Amos turned to Ezekiel, his voice filled with urgency. "What do we do? How do we stop this?" Ezekiel shook his head. "There is no stopping it. The fire from the stars will fall. All we can do is survive." The people panicked, running in all directions as the sky began to crackle with energy. A massive, fiery object appeared in the distance, descending from the heavens like a falling star. It grew larger and larger, its bright glow filling the sky, casting an eerie light over the colony. Hosea's breath caught in his throat. "Is this the end?" he whispered. Amos stood frozen, his heart pounding as the fiery object descended closer. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a celestial force far beyond the realm of human control. The rebellion, the fight for justice, all of it now seemed insignificant in the face of this apocalyptic event. "We have to go!" Amos shouted, snapping out of his shock. "We have to get the people to safety!" As the celestial object drew nearer, the ground began to shake more violently. Buildings crumbled and fires erupted across the colony. The people screamed, running in all directions, but there was no escape, and above them, the stars continued to fall. And so it was that the heavens opened, and the fire from the stars fell upon Carthage 9, bringing with it destruction and chaos. And in that moment, the fate of the colony hung in the balance, as the people faced not only the sins of man, but the judgment of the cosmos. And behold, Elijah wandered in the wilderness, far from the people he had once fought to free. His heart was heavy, for the fire of rebellion had burned within him, but now the flame was cold and he was alone. Elijah sat on the edge of a crumbling cliff, the stars above him burning bright and distant. The wild desert stretched out in every direction, a desolate sea of dust and rock, untouched by the struggles of men. His ship lay dormant behind him, its engines silent, grounded as he was. The sky, so vast and empty, had always been a place of freedom for Elijah, but now it seemed like a prison, an infinite expanse that could not hide him from himself. His hands, scarred from countless battles, gripped the edges of his cloak, the fabric rough beneath his fingers. How many times had these hands struck down his enemies? How many times had they sought justice through fire and steel, believing that force could shape the world into something better? He had once believed that destruction was the only path to freedom, that tearing down the corrupt rulers of Carthage 9 was the only way to give the people their lives back. But now, as he sat alone under the stars, that belief felt hollow. "What have I become?" Elijah whispered, his voice carried away by the desert wind. The memory of Jeremiah's face flashed in his mind, the sorrow in his eyes as he had pleaded for a different path. Jeremiah had tried to warn him, tried to pull him back from the edge, but Elijah had been too consumed by his rage, too blinded by the righteousness of his own cause. He had left the colony in flames, believing that fire could cleanse it. But fire only destroys. In the stillness of the night, Elijah felt the weight of his actions, the lives he had taken, the chaos he had unleashed. He had once thought himself a warrior of justice, but now he saw that he had become something else, something darker, and that realization tore at him in ways no enemy ever could. What is justice if it leaves nothing but ashes? For days, Elijah had wandered, searching for meaning in the barren wilderness, waiting for a sign, any sign, that his path had not been in vain. But there was only silence, until tonight. As the stars shifted overhead, a streak of light crossed the sky, burning through the heavens with an intensity that set Elijah's heart racing. He stood, eyes wide, watching as the fiery trail grew brighter, more vivid, until it seemed to sear the very fabric of the night. In that moment, something stirred within him, something deeper than rage, deeper than the need for vengeance. It was the fire of purpose, but not the kind that destroys. It was the fire of protection, the fire that shields and unites. And in that instant, Elijah knew what he had to do. And it came to pass that Elijah, the lone rebel, returned from the wilderness, his heart renewed, for the time of destruction had passed, and the time of unity had come. The people of Carthage 9 had gathered in the central square, their eyes fixed on the sky. The strange celestial lights that had haunted them for weeks now burned with an intensity that filled them with fear. Rumors of a coming catastrophe spread like wildfire, and the colony, still reeling from the rebellion and its aftermath, stood on the edge of collapse. Amos stood before the people, his voice raised in a call for calm, but the fear in the crowd was palpable. Ezekiel, the visionary, had warned of this, of the fire from the stars that would bring destruction. But his words had only deepened the panic. The people no longer knew where to turn, who to trust. "We must hold together," Amos shouted, his voice straining over the growing murmur of the crowd. "This is not the end. We can survive this, but only if we stay united." His words, though filled with hope, seemed to fall on deaf ears. The colony was breaking. The people, already fractured by the rebellion, were losing faith, and Amos, for all his fire and conviction, felt the weight of that burden crushing him. Then out of the darkness came a figure. At first, no one noticed. The people were too focused on the sky, too consumed by the fear of what was to come. But slowly, the crowd began to turn, whispers spreading like ripples in water. Elijah. The name carried weight, a name that once inspired both fear and awe. The lone rebel, the man who had led the charge against the magistrate with fire and blood, had returned. But something was different. Elijah walked into the square, his presence commanding. but not with the same violent energy that had once defined him. His steps were steady, purposeful, and there was a calm in his eyes, a calm that cut through the chaos around him. Amos met his gaze, his breath catching in his throat. This was not the Elijah he had known. This was a man changed. The crowd parted as Elijah moved forward, his voice low but filled with strength. "The time for fire is over." Amos stepped down, meeting Elijah in the center of the square. "You've returned," Amos said, his voice filled with both relief and uncertainty. Elijah nodded, his eyes scanning the faces of the people around them. "I've seen what destruction brings. I've seen what my hands have done." His voice wavered, but only for a moment. "We will not survive if we keep tearing each other apart. There is another way." Amos frowned, his brow furrowed. "Another way? What are you saying?" Elijah turned to face the crowd, raising his voice so all could hear. "We've fought for justice, but justice is not won through violence alone. Justice is what binds us together, not what tears us apart. If we are to survive, we must become one, not as rebels, not as rulers, but as a people united under a single purpose." The crowd was silent, their eyes locked on Elijah. The fear that had gripped them moments before now seemed to hang in the air, waiting for something, waiting for him to give them direction. "The fire from the stars is coming," Elijah continued, his voice strong, resonant. "But it is not just a force of destruction, it is a test of who we are, of what we can become. We must not face it as a fractured colony. We must face it as one people, united by justice, by faith, by a purpose greater than ourselves." Amos watched in awe as the crowd seemed to shift, their fear giving way to something else, something deeper. For the first time in days there was hope, and it was Elijah who had given it to them. "Lead us," a voice called from the crowd. "We'll follow you." Elijah shook his head, his eyes softening. "No, this is not my fight alone. This is our fight. We stand together or we fall together." And so it was that Elijah, the lone rebel, returned not as a destroyer, but as a protector, a leader of the people. And the colony, once divided, began to gather around him, for they saw in him the strength not of one man, but of a people united. And it came to pass that as the fires from the heavens burned bright, the rulers of Carthage 9 made their final move. For they had seen the fear in the hearts of the people, and they sought to seize control through the power of darkness and deception. The magistrates' chambers were filled with smoke, the scent of burning metal and the flicker of dying lights, casting eerie shadows on the walls. What remained of the ruling elite had gathered in desperation. The rebellion had broken their grip on the colony, but it had not shattered their will, not yet. Magistrate Kore stood at the head of the room, his face pale, but his eyes gleaming with determination. The colony was teetering on the edge of collapse, and outside the walls, the people were terrified of the cosmic fire blazing in the sky. It was a chaos he intended to use. "We still hold power here," Kore said, his voice firm, though laced with exhaustion. "The people are frightened, and frightened people will follow anyone who promises them safety." His lieutenants exchanged uncertain glances. The fires in the sky, the strange omens Ezekiel had warned of, they were growing worse. Some of the more superstitious members of the ruling council had fled already, leaving only the hardliners. "The rebellion has taken most of the colony," one of the lieutenants said, his voice trembling. "What makes you think they'll listen to us now?" Kore's lips twisted into a cold smile. "Because I have something they don't, fear. The rebels promise hope, but they cannot save the people from what's coming. Only we can. If we make them see the truth, that their only chance of survival lies in order in strength, they will fall in line." The magistrate turned, his eyes narrowing as he addressed the room. "We will tell them the truth, that the fire in the sky is divine punishment sent for their rebellion, that it will only stop if they return to us, if they submit, and if they do not—" His voice dropped to a sinister whisper. "We will make sure the fires finish what they started." The room was silent, the weight of Korah's plan sinking in. This was no longer about control, it was about domination. The people were vulnerable, desperate. If they were to be saved, they would need to hear a voice louder than fear, a voice of hope. And lo, the fires from the heavens grew more fierce, and the people of the colony trembled. They gathered in the streets, their eyes turned to the sky, fearing the wrath that seemed to descend upon them. And in the midst of their fear, the rulers came, seeking to reclaim their power through lies. In the central square, the people stood huddled together, watching the sky in terror. The fire that had blazed across the heavens now filled the night with a haunting red glow, casting long shadows over the streets. Rumors of divine punishment and alien wrath spread like wildfire, fueled by the chaos of the rebellion. The rebels themselves, once united by a shared cause, were now fractured. Some wanted to fight on. Others feared the cosmic signs were beyond their control. Amos stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart heavy with uncertainty. The rebellion had won a few key victories, but now the colony was paralyzed with fear, and it was becoming clear that without a unifying force, they could fall back into the hands of the very rulers they had sought to overthrow. "They're coming," Amos said softly, turning to Hosea, who stood beside him, his face grim. Hosea nodded, his fists clenched at his sides. "The magistrate will play on their fear. If we don't stop him now, everything we've fought for will be lost." The crowd stirred as a group of black armored enforcers marched into the square. Behind them, Magistrate Korah appeared, his voice booming through a loudspeaker as he addressed the trembling masses. "People of Carthage," he shouted, his voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. "The fire in the sky is no accident. It is divine judgment, sent to punish those who have defied the order of this colony. You have been led astray by false prophets, by those who seek to tear down the very structure that keeps us safe." Amos felt a surge of anger rise within him as the people began to murmur, their fear growing under the weight of Korah's words. "This is what happens when you abandon the order we built," Korah continued. "But there is still time. Submit, return to the fold, and we will protect you from the fires that descend from the heavens. Only through obedience can you be saved." The crowd's murmurings grew louder, uncertainty rippling through them. Hosea stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion. "We cannot let them fall for this," Hosea said. "Not again. The people need to hear the truth. They need to hear hope." Amos placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice steady. "Then let them hear it from you." And it came to pass that Hosea, the betrayed survivor, stepped forward into the midst of the people, his heart filled with the weight of forgiveness and hope. For though he had been broken by the betrayals of the past, he now saw that the people needed him, and he could no longer stand in the shadows. Hosea took a deep breath, his mind racing as he stepped in front of the crowd, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the people who had once betrayed him. He had spent so long running from this moment, from the pain and the doubt that still lingered in his heart. But now, standing in the center of the square with the fires of the cosmos blazing above them, he knew what he had to do. "People of Carthage," Hosea's voice rang out, cutting through the noise of the crowd. The murmurs fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. "You know me," Hosea continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You know who I am, and you know what has happened to me. I fought for this colony. I trusted its leaders, and they left me for dead. But I am not here to speak of betrayal." The crowd watched him, their fear mingling with curiosity. "I am here to speak of forgiveness." A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd, and even Amos looked at Hosea with surprise. But Hosea pressed on. "We have all made mistakes, we have all been hurt. But if we let that pain guide us, if we let it keep us divided, we will never survive what's coming. We cannot fight the fire from the sky with fear. We can only fight it together, united." Hosea's voice grew stronger, his words filled with passion. "The rulers of this colony have lied to you. They want you to be afraid because they know fear is the only weapon they have left. But I am here to tell you, there is another way. There is hope." The crowd was silent, their eyes wide as they listened to him. "I forgive you," Hosea said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I forgive this colony for what it did to me. And now, I ask you to forgive each other, to forgive yourselves, because we cannot survive if we are divided." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd, and Hosea felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The people were listening. They were hearing him. "We will not submit to fear," Hosea shouted, his voice rising. "We will not return to the hands of the men who betrayed us. We will stand together, and we will face what's coming as one." The crowd erupted in cheers, the fear that had gripped them moments before now beginning to fall away. And behold, the people of Carthage 9 rose as one, their fear replaced with a newfound unity. But the rulers of the colony would not yield, and they sought to crush this rebellion of hope. And thus began the final battle, the clash between light and dark. Magistrate Corre watched as the crowd cheered for Hosea, his lips twisting in anger. He had counted on their fear, their willingness to submit. But now, this upstart, this man he had once written off, was turning them against him. "Enough!" Corre bellowed, his voice filled with fury. He raised his hand, and the enforcers moved forward, their weapons drawn. "You think you can stand against us?" Corre shouted, his eyes wild. "We are the law, we are the order, and you are nothing without us." But before the enforcers could strike, a new voice rang out from the crowd, a voice filled with fire and strength. "You are nothing but cowards!" Elijah stepped forward, his eyes blazing as he moved to stand beside Hosea, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the square. "You have ruled through fear for too long," Elijah said, his voice cold. "But your time is over. These people don't belong to you. They belong to themselves, and they will not bow to your lies any longer." Corre sneered, his hand tightening on the hilt of his blade. "You think you can stop us? You, who brought fire and destruction to this colony? You are no better than we are." Elijah's gaze hardened, his jaw set. "I was once like you, yes, but not anymore. I've seen what destruction brings, and I've seen what unity can create. The people will not follow you into darkness, Corre. They will follow the light." Corre's eyes flickered with rage, and he drew his blade, pointing it at Elijah. "Then you will die with them." The enforcers charged forward, but the people of the colony, now united behind Elijah and Hosea, stood their ground. Armed with nothing but hope and the strength of their unity, they pushed back, their numbers overwhelming the enforcers. In the chaos, Corre lunged at Elijah, but Elijah was ready. With swift, precise movements, Elijah disarmed him, sending Corre's blade clattering to the ground. "This is the end for you," Elijah said, his voice low but firm. "But it's just the beginning for the people." Corre, his face twisted with hatred, spat at Elijah's feet. "You think you've won, but the fire in the sky will destroy you all, and when it does, you'll wish you had followed me." Elijah shook his head. "No, we will face it together, and we will survive." With that, Corre was led away, and the last remnants of the old order crumbled into dust. And so it was that the corrupt rulers of Carthage 9 were overthrown, not through violence alone, but through the unity of the people. And as the fires in the sky burned brighter, the prophets stood ready, for the final test was yet to come. And behold, the skies over Carthage 9 were filled with fire, and the people trembled. For though they had cast off the chains of their rulers, a greater test now loomed before them, a test of fire and faith. The cosmic fire that had burned bright in the heavens now filled the entire sky, turning night into an eerie, glowing twilight. The atmosphere crackled with strange energy, and a low, rumbling sound echoed across the colony. The people of Carthage 9, though united, were filled with fear as they looked upward, unsure of what was to come. Amos stood with Hosea and Elijah on a platform in the center of the square, their faces illuminated by the flickering red light from above. Around them the people gathered, waiting, watching. The rebellion was over, the rulers defeated, but the fire from the sky had not been stopped. Ezekiel appeared, his eyes wide and wild as he strode into the square, his voice filled with both awe and dread. "It is coming," he said, his voice low but clear. "The fire is coming, the stars have spoken, and their judgment is upon us." Hosea stepped forward, his heart pounding. He had forgiven the colony, had found his place among the people, but now a new fear gripped him, a fear that no amount of forgiveness could overcome this cosmic force. "What do we do?" someone in the crowd called, their voice filled with panic. "How do we survive?" The question hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. The people turned to the prophets, their eyes pleading for guidance. They had cast off the corrupt rulers, but now they faced something beyond their understanding. Elijah, his face calm but resolute, stepped forward. His voice was steady, though his heart was pounding with the weight of what lay ahead. "We face this together," Elijah said, his voice strong. "The fire in the sky is not our enemy. It is a test of who we are, of what we can become. We have fought to free ourselves from the chains of fear, but now we must face the ultimate test of our faith." The people murmured, their fear palpable, but Elijah's presence seemed to calm them. "Ezekiel," Elijah called, turning to the visionary. "What have the stars shown you? What must we do?" Ezekiel's eyes were filled with a strange light as he looked up at the sky. "The fire will fall and the earth will shake. But we are not meant to be destroyed. This is not the end, it is the beginning. We must come together as one, under the light of the stars. Only then can we survive." Hosea frowned, his heart heavy with doubt. "But how, Ezekiel? How do we survive something like this?" Ezekiel turned to him, his gaze intense. "By trusting in the stars, in each other, by believing that we are more than the sum of our fears. The fire will fall, but it will not destroy us so long as we stand together." And so it was that the prophet stood before the people of Carthage 9, and they called them to stand together, for the fire in the sky was not just a test of their strength, but of their faith. And the people, though afraid, gathered as one. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a low, thunderous roar filled the air as the cosmic fire drew closer, streaking across the sky in waves of red and gold. The people gathered in the center of the colony, their eyes wide with fear, but their hearts guided by a new sense of unity. Elijah raised his hand, calling for silence. His voice rang out over the crowd, firm but filled with conviction. "Do not fear the fire. Do not let your hearts be troubled. We have faced worse, and we have survived. This is not the end. It is the beginning of something greater." Jonah, who had kept to the edges of the crowd, stepped forward, his face tense but determined. He had never wanted to lead, never wanted to take on the burden of guiding the people. But now, standing before them, he knew that there was no one else who could do what needed to be done. "Elijah's right," Jonah said, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "The fire in the sky, it's more than just a storm, it's a reckoning. We've been given a chance, a second chance to prove that we can stand as one, that we can be more than what we were." The people turned to Jonah, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. He had never wanted their faith, but now he had it. He had to make sure they didn't fall apart. "We'll make it through this," Jonah said, his voice steady. "But we need to hold together. No more division, no more fear. We face this fire and we come out on the other side stronger than we were before." Hosea stepped beside Jonah, his heart still heavy with the weight of the unknown, but something in Jonah's words stirred hope in him. He turned to the crowd, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "I once believed that this colony was beyond saving," Hosea said. "I believed that we had betrayed ourselves too many times to deserve redemption. But I was wrong. We are not beyond saving, we are not beyond hope. If we can stand together now, if we can face this fire as one, we will prove that we are worthy of a second chance." The crowd was silent, the weight of Hosea's words sinking in. He had been the survivor, the one who had carried the burden of betrayal, but now he stood before them, offering forgiveness not just to them, but to himself. Elijah looked at the faces of the people. Their fear mingled with hope, and he knew that this was the moment. This was their test. "The stars are watching us," Elijah said, his voice steady, "and they will see us rise. Stand with me. Stand with all of us, and together we will face whatever comes." And lo, the sky above Carthage 9 grew dark, and the fire from the heavens burned bright. The people gathered in the square, their hearts filled with both fear and hope. and the prophets, standing before them, raised their voices in unity. As the fire blazed closer, the earth beneath the colony trembled violently, and the air grew thick with heat and electricity. The strange celestial lights danced across the sky, casting an otherworldly glow over the faces of the people. They clung to one another, their fear palpable, but their faith in the prophets keeping them grounded. Ezekiel stepped forward, his eyes wide with the intensity of his vision. He raised his arms toward the sky, his voice echoing through the square. "The time is here. The stars have spoken, and the fire is upon us, but we will not be consumed, we will not be broken." Amos, standing beside Ezekiel, turned to the crowd, his voice calm and strong. "Do not be afraid. We have come through the fire before, and we will come through it again. This is not the end, it is a test of who we are, of what we can become." The ground beneath them shook, and the sky blazed with fiery light as the celestial storm intensified. The people huddled closer together, their fear mixing with the strange sense of anticipation that seemed to fill the air. Elijah stepped forward, his eyes blazing with determination. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the people who had fought beside him, who had trusted him, even when he had led them into darkness. Now they looked to him for hope. "We are more than the fear that binds us," Elijah shouted, his voice rising over the roar of the cosmic fire. "We are stronger than the forces that seek to destroy us. Stand with me now, and we will face this fire together." The people raised their voices in response, their fear slowly giving way to the strength of unity. Elijah turned to Jonah and Hosea, nodding in silent understanding. This was their moment. This was the moment they had been called to lead. And so it was that the prophets of Carthage 9 stood together, leading the people as one. The fire from the heavens grew closer, but the people did not scatter. They stood united, ready to face the final test. And behold, the fire from the heavens drew near, its light filling the sky as the stars trembled in their places. The people of Carthage 9 stood in the central square, their hearts heavy with fear and hope. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the air grew thick with the heat of the cosmic storm. The fire in the sky had transformed from a distant, glowing light to an all-consuming presence. The horizon burned with waves of red and gold, streaking across the heavens like a divine force, threatening to consume everything in its path. The colony shook under the weight of the celestial convergence, and the people clung to one another, searching for strength in the faces of their neighbors. At the center of it all, the prophets stood united. Elijah, Hosea, Jonah, and Ezekiel, each carrying the weight of their pasts, each prepared to guide the colony through this final trial. The time had come for them to step fully into their roles as spiritual leaders. "The fire will fall, but we will not be consumed," Ezekiel said, his voice trembling with the intensity of his vision. "The stars have spoken to me. This is our test, our chance to prove that we are worthy of the future that awaits us." Jonah, his face set in grim determination, addressed the crowd. "There's no running from this," he said, his voice steady. "The time for fear is over. We've spent too long divided, too long afraid. Now, we stand together, or we fall together." The people murmured in agreement, but their fear was still palpable. The cosmic storm above them was unlike anything they had ever seen, unlike anything they could comprehend. Amos raised his hands, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Do not be afraid. We have come through the fire before, and we will come through it again. This is not the end, it is the beginning. A new age is upon us, but we must face it together." The crowd began to calm, their fears slowly giving way to the hope that Amos, Elijah, and the others had instilled in them. They were not alone. They were not without purpose. They were part of something greater, something divine. And lo, Elijah, the lone rebel, stood before the people, his heart filled with the fire of redemption. For though he had once sought to bring down the rulers of Carthage 9 through destruction, he now stood as a protector, guiding the people toward unity and hope. Elijah's eyes swept over the crowd, his heart pounding with both fear and purpose. He had spent so long believing that strength came from destruction, from tearing down the corrupt forces that oppressed the people. But now, standing before them, he saw that true strength came not from violence, but from unity, from standing together as one. "This fire," Elijah began, his voice carrying over the crowd, "it is not here to destroy us, it is here to test us. We have fought for so long, against rulers, against fear, against ourselves, but now the fight is not about tearing down, it's about building something new." The people watched him, their fears subsiding as they listened to his words. Elijah, once the symbol of rebellion and chaos, had become something more, something greater. He had become their protector, their leader. "This is our moment," Elijah said, his voice rising with conviction. "We stand here together, not as rebels or outcasts, but as a people united. The fire in the sky cannot destroy us because we are more than flesh and blood. We are hope, we are unity, and together we will face whatever comes." The crowd erupted in cheers, their fear melting away as they felt the strength of Elijah's words. They no longer saw the fire in the sky as a force of destruction, but as a test they could pass if they stood together. Elijah turned to Jonah and Hosea, his eyes burning with determination. "It's time," he said, his voice low but steady. "We face this together." And it came to pass that Hosea, the survivor, stepped forward to stand before the people. His heart, once heavy with the weight of betrayal, was now filled with forgiveness and hope. For though he had been broken, he had been healed, and he sought to lead the people toward healing as well. Hosea looked out at the faces of the crowd, at the men and women who had once betrayed him, who had left him to die in the wake of their own fear. But now, as the fire from the sky drew closer, he no longer saw them as enemies. He saw them as his people, his family. "I have carried the weight of betrayal for too long," Hosea said, his voice filled with emotion. "But that weight has been lifted, not because I am strong, but because I have learned to forgive. I have forgiven this colony, and now I ask you to forgive yourselves." The people were silent, their eyes fixed on Hosea as his words washed over them. He had been the embodiment of their own guilt, their own shame. But now he stood as a symbol of redemption. If Hosea could forgive them, perhaps they could forgive themselves. "We cannot move forward if we are still chained to the past," Hosea continued, his voice soft but powerful. "The fire in the sky, it's not just a test of our strength, it's a test of our hearts. We must forgive ourselves for our failures, for our fears, and we must rise together." The crowd murmured in agreement, their hearts slowly opening to the possibility of redemption. Hosea had forgiven them. Perhaps they could be redeemed after all. And behold, Jonah, the reluctant leader, stepped forward to join Elijah and Hosea. Though he had once fled from his calling, he now stood before the people as their guide, for the time of reluctance had passed, and the time of leadership had come. Jonah took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the crowd. He had never wanted this. He had never wanted to be a leader, to carry the weight of an entire colony on his shoulders. But now, standing beside Elijah and Hosea, he knew that he could no longer run from his responsibility. "We're not here because of fate," Jonah said, his voice pragmatic and firm. "We're here because we made choices. We chose to fight. We chose to stand together. And now, we're choosing to face whatever's coming. We've been tested before, and we'll be tested again. But we'll survive, because we know how to make the hard choices." The people nodded, their faith in Jonah growing as they listened to his words. He was not a prophet, he was not a visionary, but he was exactly what they needed. A leader who understood that survival was not about hope alone. It was about practical action, about making the tough decisions that no one else wanted to make. "We're not going to fall apart," Jonah continued. "Not because we have faith, but because we have each other. The fire in the sky, it's not going to stop us. We're going to face it, and we're going to come out stronger on the other side." Elijah smiled at Jonah, a look of silent understanding passing between them. Jonah had finally accepted his role. The colony had their leader. And lo, The people of Carthage 9 stood united, their fear replaced with hope, their division replaced with unity. The fire from the heavens blazed bright, but the people did not tremble, for they knew that they were more than their fear. They were a people awakened, a people redeemed. As the fire in the sky blazed closer, the colony began to glow with a strange, ethereal light. The ground shook beneath them, and the air was filled with the sound of the cosmos trembling. But the people stood firm, their hearts no longer filled with fear, but with hope. Ezekiel raised his arms, his eyes wide with awe. "This is it," he said, his voice trembling. "The stars have spoken. The fire is not our enemy. It is our awakening. It is the moment we have been waiting for." The people gathered closer, their hands clasped in unity, their voices rising in a chant of hope and faith. The prophet stood before them, guiding them through this moment of cosmic convergence, their leadership bringing the colony to its ultimate test. "We are more than the forces that seek to destroy us," Elijah shouted, his voice filled with fire. "We are a people united, a people awakened, and we will not fall." The fire in the sky blazed brighter, filling the entire atmosphere with light. The ground shook violently, but the people did not scatter. They stood together, their voices rising in unity, their hearts filled with the knowledge that they had faced their fear and overcome it. In that moment, the colony of Carthage 9 was not just a group of survivors. They were a people reborn, a people with purpose, with faith, with unity. And so it was that the people of Carthage 9 passed through the fire and emerged on the other side, not as they were, but as something greater. The cosmic forces that had once threatened them were now silent, and the stars shone brightly in the sky, a symbol of the colony's survival. The fires in the sky had passed, and the air was clear once more. The people of Carthage 9 stood in the central square, their faces turned toward the stars, their hearts filled with hope. The prophets stood among them, their leadership having guided the colony through the darkest of times. Elijah, Hosea, Jonah, and Ezekiel had each fulfilled their roles. Elijah the protector, Hosea the redeemer, Jonah the reluctant leader, Ezekiel the visionary. Together they had led the colony to its spiritual awakening, guiding the people through the trial of fire and fear. As the dawn broke over the horizon, the people knew that they were no longer bound by the past. They were free, they were united, and they were ready to face the future, whatever it might hold. And thus, the colony of Carthage 9 entered a new age, an age not of fear or division, but of hope and unity. The prophets had led them through the fire, and now they stood together as one people, ready to face whatever the stars had in store. In the wake of the celestial fire, the dawn broke over Carthage 9, casting its first light on a world that had been tested and transformed. The people stood together in the central square, the air still humming with the echoes of the cosmic storm that had threatened to consume them. Yet here they stood, not as the fearful or the divided, but as a people who had faced the unknown and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. The stars, which had once trembled with judgment, now shimmered softly in the early morning sky as though bearing witness to the resilience of those who had defied their fate. The fire had come not as their end, but as a trial, a crucible that had burned away the divisions and fears that once held them captive. In its flames, they had found not destruction, but clarity. Through the fire, they had become something new. Elijah, once a man of destruction, stood with his eyes on the horizon. The wild rage that had driven him for so long had given way to a deep, calm resolve. He had learned that justice is not forged through violence, but through unity. He had seen the colony teeter on the edge of ruin, and he had brought them back, not by tearing down their oppressors, but by lifting up their spirits. Now, he stood as a protector, humbled by the path he had walked, yet proud of the people he had led to this new beginning. Beside him, Amos reflected on the journey they had all endured. He had come to Carthage 9 with fire in his heart, believing that justice would be delivered by force. Yet in the end, it was not the words of rebellion that had saved them, but the faith of a people learning to trust each other once more. Amos had learned that true justice is not about punishment, but about healing. healing the wounds of the past, healing the divisions between hearts, and giving birth to a vision of the future where no one is left behind. Hosea stood a little apart from the others, watching the people as they gathered in the light of the new day. His heart, once heavy with the scars of betrayal, now felt lighter. He had faced his past, forgiven the ones who had wronged him, and in doing so, had found the strength to forgive himself. He had been a man driven by pain, but now he was guided by hope. Hosea had learned that redemption is not an individual journey, but a collective one. His forgiveness had become a bridge, a way for the people to cross from the pain of their old lives to the promise of something new. Ezekiel, the visionary, stood quietly, his eyes still turned to the stars. He had seen this moment in the flickering light of distant constellations, had heard the whispers of judgment long before the fire had arrived. Yet even he had not known the fullness of what was to come. The stars had not merely judged, they had offered a choice, and the people of Carthage 9 had chosen wisely. Ezekiel smiled softly, knowing that the true power of the cosmos is not in its ability to destroy, but in its ability to transform. The fire had passed, but its lessons remained. The people of Carthage 9 had learned that power does not reside in the hands of the few, nor in the rule of fear, but in the hearts of those who stand together. They had learned that survival is not a matter of strength, but of solidarity. Each person, whether they had once been oppressor or oppressed, had found their place in the whole, bound by a shared faith in something greater than themselves. As the first rays of sunlight touched the colony, there was no longer talk of rebellion nor of rulers and subjects. There was only the sense of a future yet to be written, a future shaped not by violence or control, but by the shared will of a people who had found their way back to each other. They had come through the fire and learned that the only chains strong enough to bind them were the ones they forged together. And so Carthage 9 stood at the dawn of a new age, not an age of fear nor of tyranny, but of unity. They were no longer the broken remnants of a colony that had lost its way. They were a people reborn, their hearts lit by the fire they had survived, their souls strengthened by the trials they had endured. The prophets had led them through the darkness, but it was the people who had chosen to rise into the light. In that moment, Carthage 9 was not merely a colony on the edge of a vast and uncaring universe. It was a beacon, a symbol of what is possible when humanity, in its most desperate hour, chooses to embrace hope rather than despair. The fire had come, and the fire had passed, but what remained was something far more enduring. The unshakable bond of a people who had learned to walk through the flames together and to build a world worthy of their struggle. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, the stars above seemed to flicker in quiet approval, as if they too had been waiting for this dawn of a new people, united, awakened, and ready to chart their own path among the stars.